Dear colleagues, welcome to the next TrueDem webinar in the series dedicated to political trust research. And the title of the presentation of today is Who Cares? Issue Salience as a key explanation for heterogeneity in citizens' approaches to political trust. In the webinar of today, our invited speaker, Lisanne de Block, examines how citizens' perception of issue salience influence the way they evaluate government performance and in turn shape the levels of political trust. Lisanne de Block is an assistant professor at the Utrecht University School of Governance. At the same time, she's managing director of research and communication at the Netherlands Institute of Governments, short NIC. She has previously held positions at Free University Amsterdam and the University of Amsterdam. In addition, she has been a visiting scholar at the Quality of Government Institute in Gothenburg, the University of Oslo, and Bocconi University in Milan. Her research focuses on the policy feedback relationship between policy performance and political support in multi-level governance systems, addressing key issues such as democratic legitimacy, welfare state performance, and uncertainty. In her recent work, she examines the role of political trust in shaping long-term climate preferences. Lisanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Happy to also meet this consortium. I've come across this consortium various times on social media, etc. So it's very nice to be here. And thanks also for the nice introduction. I think one thing to also add is that I'm also part of this network on political trust. And we have also a section this year on the ECPR General Conference. So I also hope to see many of you there. I also organize it with Ben Said and Tom van der Meer. So that's also maybe nice for your consortium. It's quite a big group of people working on political trust, and maybe some of you are already part of it. But anyway, today I'll be presenting an article that I published last year in Social Indicators Research on indeed the role of issue salience. Some more information about me. So I've been doing research on political trust for about 10 years or so, and I did my PhD project indeed at the University of Amsterdam, which really focused on this link between government performance and political trust. And it focused on trying to explain this so-called rational model, and also try to explain what are the key conditions of this model? If indeed political trust is driven by government performance evaluations, what are the underlying assumptions that we should test? And one of our work focused on responsibility perceptions. So it matters who people think is responsible for the state of the economy, for example. I also studied the role of personal experience together with Stefan Kumlin, focusing more on people's personal interactions with, for example, the welfare state and how that shaped their political trust. And in this particular paper, I look at the moderating role of issue salience. More recently, I focused on the role of institutional design of political trust. So how can we design decision-making arrangements, but also implementations, procedures in such a way that it fosters more or less political trust. I did an experiment on accountability arrangement together with Lars Brummel, how social and political accountability helps people accept certain policy outcomes and helps build political trust also among losers. And I did some more work also with Catherine de Vries on decision-making procedures within the EU and how that helps to build political trust in the EU. And lastly, I also focus on the consequences of political trust currently, particularly for people's democratic commitments, so people's preferences for democratic procedures, particularly in the face of climate threats, together with Hannah Werner from the University of Zurich. And I focus on political trust for long-term policy support together with Marius Busemeyer. And I also have a project with Barbara Vis and Kees van Kesbergen. So despite about 10 years of research, I'm still not sick of it, of political trust. I still really enjoy it. And as such, I'm also happy to be here to talk about some of my work. the basis of most of my work, particularly on this link between performance evaluations and political trust, really focuses on this trust as evaluation approach. And this model is really, as you probably know, quite dominant in the literature. So it's a really core explanation, this idea that political trust is driven by how satisfied people are with government performance, and that they have more or less trust depending on how satisfied they are. At the same time, even though it's a very dominant model, there's also some critique, particularly that, for example, the explanatory power of this model significantly varies across context. And there's more critique. We can talk about it after if you want, to what extent is trust really rational, etc. But still, this particular critique I focus on here is really this heterogeneity in this link. So sometimes there seems to be a consistent link between policy issue satisfaction, economic satisfaction, for example, and political trust. And sometimes this link appears to be much weaker. And how can we explain this variation in trust bases? The underlying question, however, is what type of performance is really being evaluated? When people have to evaluate government performance, you can consider all range of facets. And typically we see that in models, scholars include either the economy, so we really see a consistent relationship between economic performance and political trust, economic satisfaction. Also builds on is economic voting literature. And more recently, we also see that welfare state performance also significantly shapes political trust. Work by, for example, Staffan Kumnin or Adela Hausjerk significantly show that how satisfied people are with healthcare and education also shapes their levels of political trust. Moving to the next. The research puzzle that this article particularly addresses is that by including, say, the economy or the welfare state, scholars implicitly assume that this is the type of policy performance that is most salient to all citizens all the time. So that it's also constant in a way across individuals, but also across time points and across contexts. But at the same time, we also know that issue salience varies across individuals and context. There's literature on economic voting, which significantly shows, particularly when it comes to the salience of the economy, that there's significant variation in the importance people attach to the economy, and that this variation in issue salience helps also explain why, for example, presidential approval, but also party support is sometimes more strongly linked to economic satisfaction than others. So there has been shown that issue salience has a really moderating influence in the role of performance evaluations on several outcomes. But the question is, what role does it play for political trust, and particularly for this so-called trust as evaluation approach? In order to understand this, it is therefore important to broaden our range of policy issues that we commonly consider. So maybe to also include other issues than just the economy and the welfare state, but also to explicitly model issue salience. So to not implicitly assume that the issues we include are the ones that are salient to citizens all the time, but actually ask people what they think is important and to use that in our models. Why would issue salience actually matter for political trust and for this relationship between government performance and political trust? Issue salience is typically seen as the relative weight an individual ascribes to a given issue on a political agenda, so how important they think a certain policy issue is. And here it's relevant to separate collective issue salience. Sorry. I'm trying to go to the next. So it's relevant to separate collective issue salience. So that is typically this question you see in the Eurobarometer. So what is the most important, most pressing issue, most important issue for your country currently at this time? So this collective issue salience, which focuses more on the importance of an issue for a particular country. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the same as personal issue salience. So it's really the importance of an issue for you personally. It can be the same, of course, as the issue that is collectively salient, but it doesn't need to be. And so far, there's limited work on the role of issue salience on political trust. There's some work by Heterogeneity and Rudolph and Shantley, but they focus really on this collective issue salience idea. They look at how the number of people saying that the economy is the most important issue at the time. But it doesn't necessarily need to be the same as personal issue salience. And why would issue salience matter? Well, we know from communication research, for example, that issue salience really shapes interest and attention and knowledge. So people are more interested in issues that they are important to them. They have more attention to it and they have more knowledge about it. And as such, there can be a priming effect of issue salience. So priming means a change in the standard that people use to make political evaluations. So when it comes to a trust judgment, you could imagine that for example, economic performance matters more when in a time of a recession, when people think it's very important. So there's a relatively more weight of this issue versus in times when the economy is not so important and people actually use other standards or rely on other issues. At the same time, issues of salience can also function as a heuristic. So it's quite a task to ask of people to evaluate all of government performance across all policy areas, which is unlikely that they will be able to monitor this all the time. So to reduce this cognitive burden, people can also rely on their most important issue, of which they have more knowledge, pay closer attention, and to use their satisfaction with that policy issue as a proxy for government performance overall. So it can also be this heuristic, this cognitive shortcut. But anyway, what it comes down to is that we believe that issue salience moderates the relationship between policy issue evaluation or government performance and political trust. You would expect that to the extent that political trust is actually based on policy issue satisfaction, the perceived performance on a policy issue that is deemed as important should have a greater effect on political trust than other issues that are not necessarily seen as important. It's a very simple idea. I was sometimes surprised nobody actually tested it before, but it's quite a straightforward idea. How do I test this? Well, the article takes two routes. And the first route is really models more what Rudolph and Hetherington did and Shantley, which looks at what is the most important issue for a country. So the so-called collective issue salience. And I used the European Social Survey, and I used the waves 2006 until 2018. So it really marks this crisis period, the economic crisis, the euro crisis, but also the periods before and after. And I think this allows for some interesting variation in the issue salience of, for example, economy. And I merged it with the Eurobarometer because actually European Social Survey doesn't have any items on issue salience. So I used the issue salience items from the Eurobarometer. And then the second route instead focuses more on personal issue salience, arguing that to really test this micro-level moderating effect, so does one policy area have a greater effect on political trust if a person deems it more important, we really need to focus on also this personal issue salience. And I use a specifically designed survey for this that I fielded in the Netherlands amongst a representative sample, using an existing panel of a probability-based sample of Dutch Bureau of Statistics. But I'll start with the first route. So as I said, I looked at the European Social Survey and the Eurobarometer, and I took political trust as an index of trust in parliament, politicians, and political parties. It's this typical question: how much do you trust each of these following actors or institutions? And trust is measured on an 11-point scale, from no trust at all to complete trust. I know we're all quite critical of this index. We can also talk about it in the in the discussion, but it is typically used. So using this index as when it comes to our independent variables, so policy issue satisfaction, I also follow a dominant approach and focus on the people's satisfaction with the state of the economy. And I use their satisfaction with healthcare and education, which I combine in the so-called welfare state index. When it comes to evaluation scores, I also center these scores to the country mean to allow for cross-country measurement error. And lastly, I model the moderating variable, collective issue salience, using the question, what are the two most important issues facing your country at the time? And they could, it was an open answer, but when they said something like the economic situation, inflation, taxation, or unemployment, I coded it as economically salient, so it's a binary variable here, economic issue salience. A welfare issue salience would be then if they refer to healthcare or education. I included some controls, age, gender, education, and as a modeling technique, I use multi-level mixed effects model with random effects at the country and country year level. So moving first to the descriptive results, I think it's interesting to have a look at these issue saliency perceptions over the course of the time period that the European Social Survey covers. And what is interesting is that we see when comparing the saliency of the economy versus the saliency of the welfare state, the economy is deemed most important by a large proportion of people, but you see some clear variation over time, where particularly after the onset of the economic crisis, the saliency of the economy really increases and it remains rather salient. But even more evident is that the saliency of the welfare state really decreases during this time. So people really shift their focus and really think that although before the crisis, still about more than 40% of the people thought that welfare state services were one of the most important issues. This really declined. So we really see some kind of trade-off there, zero-sum game. And then if we then look at the effects, so this is the effect of economic performance on political trust and the effect of welfare state service evaluations on political trust across time. So it's interacted with the time variable. We see that also their relative effects over time change. So indeed, actually interesting, before the crisis, we see that they have about similar effects on political trust. So welfare state satisfaction and economic satisfaction have equal effects on political trust. But as the economic crisis proceeds, we really see that more weight is given to economic performance. So economic satisfaction has a greater effect on political trust, whereas the effect of welfare state services really decreases. So there seems to be parallel trends when it comes to issue saliency. And when we model this using this so-called three-way interaction, which is always very hard to interpret, we do see that actually, particularly when it comes to welfare state services, so things that are not the economy, we see that indeed whether or not the welfare state was seen as important by a larger proportion of people really moderates the effect on political trust. So as we saw that as less people considered the welfare state as most important, the effect of welfare state services on political trust was really much smaller. So particularly for the welfare state, for things that are not economic performance, it really matters to really model this, explicitly model this collective issue salience. And it helps us understand why in certain contexts welfare services do matter for political trust, and in others it doesn't necessarily so. But still, as I said, this is only one route to take, and I think the better and causally more stringent test is by using really personal issue salience, by really asking specifically, what do you find important, and also asking how satisfied they are with different types of policy areas. So the second route, I used Dutch data from 2022. For my dependent variable, I use the identical approach to European Social Survey, more as a robustness check. So it's this index of trust in parliament, politicians, parties. But I also use a measure of political trust that is more domain specific. And this is more aligned with this idea that political trust, I think Hardin also said it, trust means A, trust B to do X. So this question also asks, how much do you trust the national authorities to do what is right for the Netherlands on policy issue X? And I asked this for 8 different policy issues. So education, healthcare, economy, social security, safety, immigration, youth care, and climate. At the same time, I also asked them to evaluate these different policy issues. So I also know how satisfied they were with each of these 8 different policy issues, measured on an 11-point scale from not satisfied at all to completely satisfied. And I also asked them what are the most important issues facing the country at the time. And then for each policy area, it was then a 0 or 1, depending on whether they refer to that issue or not. Actually, I think I'm making a mistake here. It should be personal issue salience. It was the most important issues for them, not at the country. So this is my mistake in the presentation. So it really captures what is the most important issue to you. Then moving to more the descriptive results. Oh, sorry, I use controls here, age, gender, and education. And before actually moving to the results, I have to say something about the modeling technique. So because all these, your satisfaction with these different policy areas, they are of course related to each other. And you cannot simply easily include them all in the same model because you would run the risk of multicollinearity. So what is the benefit of this data set is because we have our outcome variable, which is measured on these 8 different policy areas, trust on these different domains. We also have satisfaction on these different domains. We can actually transpose our data set from a wide format to a more long format. So now we actually have observations that are clustered within individuals. We have policy areas are clustered within individuals. And that allows us to perform a random effects within between models, so to actually use this multi-level model that actually accounts for variation between individuals, this cluster confounding, the fact that some people might be just more positive and more happy, more trusting. But it also models within person variation. So to what extent does a relatively more satisfied to what extent does it matter that you're relatively more satisfied with one policy area versus another? Does that mean that you are also relatively more trusting for the government in that policy area relative to others? So it really disentangles this between and within component. The between component is then the overall satisfaction across all policy areas for a given individual, and the within component is to how satisfied they are with all policy areas overall. Moving to the descriptive results, what is interesting about this particular time period, 2022, is that there wasn't really a crisis. So it was kind of post-COVID. We were at the tail of the COVID crisis. And you can really see it in when you study issue salience. So we asked people what issues are personally important to you, and we did see that quite a group considered healthcare still important. This is also because it was at the end of the COVID crisis. But still, there's not really a clear consensus. So a quarter of the sample also considered the economy important. A quarter also saw the climate as important, and someone less so also mentioned education or safety. So there was not really a consensus, which is interesting about this period. And when we then modeled, this is just simple OLS, so not the modeling strategy I just talked about, but when we just individually model each policy area and see how each policy area has an effect on political trust, you see that also their relative effects vary. So for example, we see that political trust has a strong correlation with how satisfied you are with healthcare, with economy, with, for example, safety and education and social security. And here it doesn't necessarily matter whether we use this ESS trust item or this more domain-specific trust item. But interestingly, for example, even though people thought healthcare was much more important, so nationally healthcare is more important, the effect is equal to, for example, social security on political trust, even though people thought this issue was much more important than other issues. At the same time, we see that climate has a very small effect on political trust. So that also says that it might not. So issue salience or collective issue salience is not the whole story. There's also probably responsibility attributions that I talked about. But still, it means that if you look at this collective issue salience, so what issues are most important for a country at a given time, you might not be able to see this individual level variation, that it kind of masks that for a given individual, it may well be that the climate, they think it's most important, and for them, it weighs very heavily in their trust judgment. So in our second step, more analytical step, we then really use this transposed data set and this random effects within between model, where we then model, we have policy areas clustered within individuals, and we explicitly also control for cluster confounding bias. What the results here show is that the first model tells us that so it's a really more strong evidence for this trust as evaluation approach. It tells us that if a given policy area is evaluated more positively than the average evaluation that this across all policy areas of this respondent, then we also see that this policy area has that people have more trust within the government on this particular policy area. But then this interaction in model 5, which is really the core of the paper, I'd say, or of this second root, it tells us that the effect of a given policy area is greater if it was also assigned as a priority or a salient issue by the individual. And what would that look like? Well, if a policy issue is not a priority, but people were still positive, it still had an effect on political trust. The effect size is about 0.47. But if it was also an issue that is important, the effect size actually increases by about 90%, so to 0.57. So personal issue salience really significantly moderates the effect of policy issue satisfaction on political trust. To move to the conclusion and the discussion, what does it mean? We see that indeed citizens tend to simplify their trust judgments by relying on heuristics such as issue salience. So they're more likely to hold the government accountable for issues that they deem important, and these weigh these issues weigh more heavily into their trust judgments. At the same time, it also means that there is significant heterogeneity in trust bases. So people can vary in what policy areas they consider in the trust bases. And these can vary between individuals, but also between time and space, depending on, for example, collective or personal issue salience. When we consider collective issue salience, we see that really economic crises seem to crowd out alternative explanations to political trust. So it really seems that during economic crisis, economic dissatisfaction is really the core explanation for political trust, and it crowds out other types of performance evaluations, such as the welfare state. So there seems to be some kind of zero-sum game there when it comes to what goes into the trust calculus. But personal salience then does matter, but particularly when there's not a consensus in the public about what should dominate the agenda. So when there's normal times or happy times, people turn to the issues that are personally salient to them, and they can help explain why people then differ in what they consider important. This also creates quite a challenge for governments who often, who are eager to increase political trust. During crisis, it's very evident of what they have to do, but during normal times, it really depends on who you ask what they should improve in terms of performance. Finally, what is interesting here is that what is the most important personal issue doesn't necessarily need to be a problem. So personal issue salience is something different than what is the most important problem. However, when you look at collective issue salience, this usually is. So when an issue that is collectively salient, it is usually quite a problem in a way. It's usually because there's a crisis or that's problematic. So when there's a consensus, it's usually because there's a crisis. That also means that national crises make political trust bases more homogeneous. So when it's clear that there's this problem, that there's a COVID pandemic, it's clear that we need to invest in healthcare or education. So then it's quite logical what drives political trust. But it also means that in absence of these crises, trust bases are more heterogeneous. Moreover, there's always this idea, or there's this, not always, but there's this idea within the literature that there's this praise-blame asymmetry, that trust is more strongly driven by negative performance, but less so a positive performance. And what this paper shows is that it may not necessarily be a praise-blame asymmetry, but rather that when issues that are nationally dominant, which are usually problems, they can overshadow the effect of other policy areas, such as areas on which it's all going well. However, in normal times, we do actually see that people also reward the government for good performance, so that political trust can also be gained by positive performance rather than just by negative performance. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm eager to hear about your questions and suggestions and thoughts.
Thank you very much, Lisanne, for this very interesting presentation. The floor is now open for a Q&A session. So please raise your hand and ask questions to Lisanne or comments. There's some comment by Araceli. Do you want to make a comment directly, Araceli? Leonard? Leonard is part of the German team of TUDEM. Please, Leonard.
Hi. Thanks for the interesting talk. I have written down a couple of questions. Maybe I can just start with one or two. Have you looked at how much the individual salience and the national salience overlap? So is there, I guess there cannot be independence. So if there's a huge media reporting of a crisis, then maybe the individual salience will also be driven by that. Is there some kind of cross-level effect from one to the other, or is like the national one simply the aggregate of the individual one? How do you measure it, and how do you disaggregate the two?
Thank you.
So sorry, should I collect a few or answer directly, Christian?
Maybe we collect two or three,
sure.
and then Pippa Norris, co-director of the TUDEM project. You have to unmute your microphone, Pippa.
You'd have thought would have learnt that by now. Thank you very much. So I was looking at the paper and I was looking at the model, table 2, etc., etc. And so what I can't see is any controls for media, because obviously people can't think about these things unless they actually think about the interaction between the government, their perceptions, and the media as the main kind of channel of some of these things. If the media suddenly gives the headline of the stock market crashing, for example, just happened to be what's going on, and people don't read that or don't know about it, then obviously that's a major interaction effect. Secondly, I was also thinking what we've got here is attitudes with attitudes, and what I really want ideally is something about performance, actual performance, aggregate performance. And so obviously that's an extension of what you're doing. And so something that will be time series, for example, GDP or unemployment or the misery index will be a natural thing to look at. And then to test whether or not you find the same thing. In other words, if they say the issue is important and we look at the actual performance rather than their perception of performance, does that actually help to explain it better? Because if you explain attitudes by attitudes, it's always a weakness. Economists will say, yes, but, it's just a nice fuzzy feeling. People trust their government and they think the economy is going well. So something outside of your survey data can easily be brought in at a macro level. So those are the two things, media and actual performance.
Thank you. The first question is from Araceli Mateos. Thank you very much for your presentation, Lisa. Very interesting. Have you taken into account institutional or political system variables such as ideology of the government and ideological self-identification as control variables? So maybe you can answer these three questions and then we carry on.
Yeah, very interesting questions. And I think as always, papers generate more questions than answers. I think I'll start with the last one. I think it's a very interesting remark to, if I consider political system, like the political color of the government, particularly when it comes to issue ownership, for example. I think this would be interesting to explore, and I haven't done so. So thanks for mentioning it, because I think indeed it's that certain types of governments might be more heavily punished by certain types of performance, such as a more left government or social democrats being more heavily held accountable for welfare state performance, for example. I think this is interesting to explore. When it comes to the Leonard's question about the overlap between individual salience and national salience, so indeed. So the drawback is that Eurobarometer only asks about national level salience, and in a way it is really an aggregate. So that's also why I have these two routes, because I think neither are ideal, and trying to combine them gives a better evidence. And I do think indeed that there would be an overlap, and I think maybe what Pippa Norris says is that indeed, if you would also allow for, say, if you include what is salient in the media, you can kind of tap into what is nationally salient without having to use the aggregate of the individual salience of people. But in my case, it is really indeed the number of people that mention a certain issue as most important for the country at a given time. So it's really a proportion, whereas more the second route, which is really focusing on personal issue salience, it is indeed about whether they thought an issue was personally important to them. But I agree, there's probably a relationship there, particularly when there's issues going on. Moving lastly to Pippa Norris questions. Yeah, I haven't control for the media, and I think this would be, if I would take this further, it would definitely be something to consider, particularly because we also I think there's quite a black box when it comes to what goes into these performance evaluations. I think there's some literature, also experimental work, studying what goes into economic evaluation. Here, there is some relationship indeed with economic information and GDP, but when it comes to these social welfare state evaluation, it's super vague what people go into it. And I think the first step in this paper is, okay, focusing first on attitudes, and I've tried to make a more causally stringent test by using this more within and between model to also allow for more between person variation. But it is the first step into, okay, if there's not a relationship there, then it's unlikely that objective performance has a political trust. It needs to run through evaluations. But I agree that the relation, like, we also need to take this step back and to also consider what is the objective performance, if there's such a thing about objective performance. I mean, how do you capture it when it comes to other things such as just the economy? There's so many variables to consider. And I would very welcome research that tells me what goes into these more alternative evaluations. I've also tried to look at personal experiences, these kind of things. But I agree that this is something that could be a next step.
Thank you. I think you focus on Netherlands Did you in your research so far also include other countries, or you just do Netherlands at different points in time?
So the European Social Survey includes 19 countries, and it's all the countries that are simultaneously included in the Eurobarometer and the European Social Survey. So that kind of determined my my sample.
Okay. And do you see regional patterns amongst these 19 countries, or you just made the aggregate of the whole of Europe?
So it's a multi-level model. So I also
Okay.
control for country and country year. So it's yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments? Leonard?
Yeah, like I said, I have a couple more here on my list, but one that kind of reflects what was also written in the chat refers to which political parties are in power and what do voters actually want. So have you tried maybe not only as a control variable, but is maybe the issue salience also the distance between what the voter wants, so maybe placed on a Galtan base or left-right, and what the political parties in power offer. So that, of course, if I'm not represented by the party that I would vote for, then I might be more critical because the issues that are important to me are not reflected in government. So maybe that's some ideas to make it, I don't know, create some kind of simpler moderator that works there.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, and I think so no, I haven't, but I think it's particularly because we often see trust as this retrospective thing. I mean, it's based on retrospective evaluation, but in essence, it's a prospective attitude, right? To what extent do you think that the government will do well on this given policy area at a given time? So indeed, it seems logical, and I think it is important to then see, okay, what are the policy programs, or what is the government program of the government in power? What issues are then raised there? And I think there's more and more work on policy congruence and how that aligns with more political trust, but this is often focusing on policy outcomes. I think it would be super interesting to also see more in terms of party platforms. Do you feel represented regardless of what actually comes out of it, but on the issues that are dominant for political parties, and how that then shapes political trust also, of course, now thinking about more populist and radical right governments. We also see in the Netherlands that people who were initially didn't really feel represented, who thought immigration was the most important issue, that now they actually have more trust. We see in the Netherlands because their issue is now currently dominating the political agenda. So I agree that that would be very interesting to look at.
Thanks.
Thank you. So your model is valid for all countries which are in the ESS and Eurobarometer jointly. So you think the model works in all of these 19 countries the same structure? I know you do multi-level analysis, but is there no Eastern European, Southern European differences, or we have a pan-European model?
I haven't. I haven't included any area controls. So I didn't allow for the fact that indeed, knowing the work from Magistro and Dottisani, it is likely that there might be the variations across regions. And I think for the simplicity of this research article, I just focused on pan-European. And in a way, I expect that maybe also the national issue salience may vary across regions, but I didn't have any hypotheses about these necessarily, and I also didn't test for it. But I can understand your question and your thoughts that probably there are some different patterns across regions, given what we know.
Yes, because in our project, we are starting 27 new member states plus Ukraine. And that's why interest in our research. There will be some analysis of regional patterns, Northern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. That's why I asked this question, because we have to deliver some comparison between the regions. But I understand your approach was different.
No, but I mean, yeah, but I mean, for example, work by Mariano Torcal also really shows that this Southern Europe has a different trajectory. And actually, I have an ongoing project with Erika van Elsass on more trends about in political trust and more about polarization. So, to what extent we've often focused on means. To what extent does political trust decline or increase over time? But if we look at variations, so to what extent is there a divergence? We really see distinct patterns in the different regions. So we really see in the West, there's a clearer polarization in political trust. We see the people moving more to the extremes, where actually in the South, there's more consensus where everyone is just distrusting. More generally. So I would definitely encourage you to consider these regional differences because I think they are meaningful.
Thank you very much, Lisanne. It's useful for our third year of research in the project. So we have 5 minutes or so left. Are there any other last comments? Irina, please. Irina is the national leader of the Trudem project in Ukraine.
First of all, thank you so much for very interesting presentation. I have a small question. Among your results, you said that national crisis makes political trust basis more homogeneous. Have you tried to search how long does this effect long? I mean, when this situation with political trust becomes some new points and that is not homogeneous anymore. I'm interested because of Ukraine, probably, because of our possible situation. How long will this effect can take place? Have you ever tried to study it in different ways? Okay, I see you hesitate.
I mean, so of course we have different. So I didn't include like a time lag, and I can tell you an answer based on kind of the graphs, but I haven't explicitly analytically modeled it. And I think it really depends, of course, on the ongoing situation. The length of different crises vary, and I think a war is of course different, an economic crisis, and here too I imagine that indeed the media can play a role in kind of shifting what is on the political agenda. So I don't think that there is a consistent answer because it really depends on what is the crisis and how is it dealt with? How is it dealt with? So yeah. I would want to give you an answer, but I couldn't.
Okay, thank you so much.